This is the third class in the series. This one is entitled Defending Perception. Last time we asked the question, what is the basic cognitive process, the one on which all the others depend? And we saw that it was perception, because perception is the awareness of reality in a form determined by the physiological nature of your senses, and therefore it's deterministic, not volitional. It's the primary source of all material. So perception is the given. All choices, all things you can control in your mind must adjust to what's perceived. That is the standard of all cognition. And I gave you my definition of perception as an ongoing awareness of discriminated entities in their relative positions in space, gained from actively acquired sensory inputs from reality. So that's recapping last time, and I wanted to elaborate a little bit by bringing in a phrase from Aquinas. It was Aristotle who grasped that perception is the given, that perception is the foundation to which all else must adjust, and that's an incredible achievement on his part. Aquinas picked that up and made it into a household phrase that you all know: nihil in intellectu, yada, yada, yada. You all know that one, right? How many nihil in intellectu? No Catholics here? Well, here's the phrase: nihil in intellectu quod non sit prius in sensu. Nothing is in the intellect that wasn't first in the senses. Now, of course, it wouldn't first be in the senses in the same form. If you conceive of a golden mountain, you've never seen a golden mountain, but you've seen gold and you've seen mountains, and you put them together. So it doesn't mean it was arranged in the same way, but it means the ultimate materials of knowledge are supplied entirely by the senses. The topic we're going to take up now is an answer to an objection. But what? Yeah, okay, so the perception is the foundation, but what if it's wrong? Descartes says maybe the content of perception is all wrong. Maybe it's put into our minds by an evil genius, an evil demon, an evil omnipotent spirit. Later, he tries to rescue things from that doubt by saying, well, there's actually a God, and God might kid us a lot, but he wouldn't radically deceive us that way. So we know that the things we perceive are actually there because God's pretty much of a good guy, and he wouldn't mess us up to that extent of making the whole world an illusion. Wonderful argument, isn't it? But perception, I'm going to show, is inerrant, which is a technical word meaning doesn't err. Now, you might think, why not say perception is infallible? Well, because it can fail in a certain sense. Perception can not give you the information you really needed to get, but only the information that it can give you given the situation you're confronting. So you can fail acting on sense perception, as when birds fly into plate glass windows because their perception does not distinguish transparent glass from empty air. So in a sense, they fail. So fallibility is not a good term for what the senses can't do. Better term is they can't make a mistake. They can't err. So we call them inerrant. When I say we, I mean me and other philosophers in the last 10 or 15 years who've started using this terminology. I don't mean objectivism. this term is a new term, inerrant. But the idea is the old idea. Galt says, man's senses cannot deceive him. His organs of perception have no volition, no power to invent or to distort. The evidence they give him is an absolute. So whatever term we use for that, this is as orthodox objectivism as it gets. We're going to confront the three categories of arguments against the senses that have arisen in the history of philosophy, and I think they'll all be familiar to you with the possible exception of the last one, and even that's to some extent familiar to everybody. And the point of confronting these is not just to smack down the skeptics. God knows I like smacking down the skeptics, but there's another positive point. You get clearer on what perception is and what its role in knowledge is as you go through these, particularly the last one. So it's actually going to be positively beneficial and informative to take up these challenges. So the first one, the argument of delusion, hallucinatory ants. The idea in this image I grabbed from the web is the ants aren't really there. The guy is taking LSD or something, and he looks at his hand and sees, in quotes, ants that aren't there. Let's get to a happier delusion rather than leaving those ants crawling on us. So the idea is this also, a guy sees Julie Andrews in The Sound of Music, but she's not there. Well, the answer is we're not seeing in the case of having a hallucination. You're not seeing those ants. You're not seeing Julie Andrews. You're having an experience internally, which is not perception. Hallucinating is not perceiving. Now, there are arguments, well, how do you know when you're hallucinating? That's not relevant. The point is, when you're hallucinating, you're not seeing. When you're seeing, you're in contact with the reality. If you're hallucinating, the solution is not epistemological. Oh, test it by this means or that means. Get medical attention. Epistemology presupposes that you are sane, awake, and not in a deluded, hallucinatory state. If you are in one of those states, the solution is, if you're insane, there is no solution. If you're asleep, wake up. If you're hallucinating, go to a doctor. So the answer to the argument from delusion is that is in the projection of a nervous system that's warped, distorted, unhealthy. Something's gone wrong. There is a cause for your experience, but the cause is not an object in reality stimulating your senses, producing a perception. It's something gone wrong in the nervous system, and your experience, which is not a perception, is a response to that. So that's pretty easily handled. Here's the more interesting one you all have heard about, the straight stick, semi-submerged in water that appears bent. A real philosophical chestnut, thousands of years old. Aristotle named the solution to this. Is that the right word? He gave the correct analysis of what's going on here. He said there's nothing wrong in your perception. What's wrong is the judgment, the conceptual identification, that's a bent stick. When you say that's a bent stick, and I use the word say deliberately, when you utter that sentence in your mind or out through your mouth, you are classifying your perception. And you are making a statement about not just this perceptual moment now, but the future. For instance, you predict, when I pull it out of water, it will look like this. That being simply this image with the bowl and the water removed. So you expect or predict or judge that it is an entity in reality which will look like this under these conditions. And that is what's mistaken. So there are, to a naive observer, misleading perceptions, that is, perceptions that tempt you to make a judgment that's false. It's really not the perception that's to blame. That's a misleading, sounds like you bad percept. You may be tempted to make the wrong judgment. The error is in the judgment. Now, there are thousands of sensory illusions, as they're called, perceptual illusions, amazing ones you can find on the web. But it doesn't matter what they are. Light colors that look dark, two lengths that look different but are the same, something that's bigger than something else but looks smaller. Doesn't matter what it is. They all fit this general formula philosophically. The senses tell us so-and-so. So-and-so is not the case. Therefore, the senses erred. Right? The senses tell us the stick is bent. The stick isn't bent. Therefore, the senses have erred. And the problem is in that first sentence, that first premise. No, the senses do not tell us so-and-so. The senses are silent. So if we take out the importation of talking into the senses, what we have is, under these conditions, this looks a certain way. Stick half in water looks like the first picture. Under different conditions, it looks a different way. So, nothing follows from that. So the error in the argument from illusion is the confusion of conceptual identification. This is a bent stick, with perception. This is what I see. Perception does not include any statements or judgments. It does not even include expectations. On the basis of past experience, you may wordlessly, or an animal may, non-conceptually, expect from a given perceptual experience something else to happen. That expectation may be wrong, but the perception isn't wrong. Only the anticipation of future perceptions might be wrong. Okay. That's all you need to say for the argument from illusion. And I stress, it does not matter what illusion is given to you. It all involves comparing the given perception with another perception, but the given perception does not say what will happen next. It just says, this is what's going on now. The most interesting and fruitful to pursue argument is the argument from the relativity of perception, which goes like this. Perception is relative. What we perceive depends upon us. And here is the argument. I believe the ancient Greeks knew this one too. Here is the example. You put one hand in icy cold water. You put the other hand in a warm bath water. You wait 2 minutes. You plunge both hands, as in the second image, into room temperature water, water in middle warmth between the two. And what happens? The same water feels warm to the hand that was cold, and cold to the hand that was warm. You know this. I mean, it's not rocket science to know that what you're used to is the standard of your perception, and you feel, if you were cold and you go to the middle, you feel warm, and if you were real warm, you go to the middle. It's common sense. Okay, so I put on the top, I call them as they are. Well, wait a minute, I'm getting contradictory signals. My senses are saying warm, cool, for the same water. So it can't be I call them as they are, because as they are would be hot and cold at the same time. It would be a contradiction. So your senses are not able to give you the real truth. They just give you the truth relative to them, right? That's the argument. This really smashed that first umpire. The traditional view, I call them as they are. What do you mean, method of cognition? I just know what the ball is. It's either a ball or a strike, and I call it as it is. Well, you call it as you see it, because you have no way of knowing what it is except based on how you perceive it. You perceive according to the nature of your sense organs. If the state of your sense organ is changed, your perception changes. If you were a bat, and some umpires are accused of being as blind as a bat, if you were a bat, you would see by means of echoes of ultrasonic sound. What is that like? What's it like to see not by light, but by, in effect, it's not radar, but it's acoustical ranging, where the bat utters squeaks, very high frequency squeaks. They bounce back, and it can see things as thin as a piano wire. I say see, it can perceive through sound as a medium, things as thin as a piano wire by the echoes that come back. It's like sonar, that's what it's like. It's exactly like sonar on a submarine. Different perception because of different sensory organs, and in this case, different source of energy being used to extract information about the environment. Okay, so the attack on the skeptics say, so we don't know what the world is like, we only know what it's like for us. We only know our internal state. The content of perception depends upon us, however, is equivocal, and this is the great positive lesson that we can draw from this. This is the most important point of the lecture. When we say the content of perception depends on us, we have to distinguish form of perception from object of perception. The argument equivocates on the difference between how we perceive the form of perception and the object that we perceive, the thing in reality. For instance, in the water example, the feeling of warmth or coolness when you put both hands in, the feeling of warmth or coolness is a feeling. It's a form of perception. The object of perception is the temperature of the water. So because of the change in the hand, the temperature, the same temperature is experienced in two different forms by two differently adapted sense organs. The form in which we perceive objects depends partly on the nature of our senses. The other part is the nature of the object and the nature of the conditions of perception. Meaning, is it foggy? Is it clear? Is it brightly lit? Is it not brightly lit? The form in which we perceive depends partly on the nature of our senses, but the object that we perceive does not. The temperature does not depend upon our sense organs. The apple that we perceive in the apple example from last time is perceived in a certain form, a form of red, round, shiny, and so forth. But the apple does not depend upon our form of perception. We would perceive it that way. We would perceive the same object even if we were bats. Bees can see ultraviolet light. We can't see it. So presumably there's some reflectance property of the apple in the ultraviolet. We don't see that. The bee does. Same apple. The object is the same. We have a different form of response from bees and bats and other organisms. Doesn't matter. All forms of perception are valid. The bee isn't, and the bat haven't got the right form of perception and we the wrong, or vice versa. All forms of perception are valid because they're all forms of perception. It's like different languages. You can't say, well, French is the right language. Well, the French try to say that. French is the right language, English is wrong, and Navajo is wrong, or Chinese is right and Hindi is wrong. There's no right or wrong language. They're all means of expressing thoughts. They're all valid. They all accomplish their goal, which raises the case of what you can say negatively about some forms of perception. The old color blindness example. You can distinguish the quantity of information, but you can't senses give you, but you can't distinguish the quality. Information is information. There's more of it you can get or less of it, but you can't say information is good information or bad information. It just is fact that you're grasping. So the colorblind person sees two shades being the same, and I put them in as sort of gray. I don't know exactly in what form a colorblind person experiences red versus green. But if you look at the red versus green, unless there's one of you who is radically red-green colorblind, I'm a little red-green colorblind, but not radically. You see that you can distinguish those two, but the ones on the right look the same until to the colorblind person in the red-green area, they look the same. They appear to have the same color. He cannot distinguish two colors that we can distinguish. So we get, as color-sighted individuals, more information. Neither one is right and neither one is wrong. It's a question of how fine a discrimination can be made. It's the same as with total blindness. You wouldn't say, oh, there's a philosophical problem because a blind person has a different form of perceiving than the sighted person. No, the blind person doesn't perceive visually. And the colorblind person does not perceive certain differences. It's not that he sees a different reality. He gets less information about the same reality. But whatever information he does get is information. He does get it. Now, here's another point that's supremely important. The form of perceiving is not similar to the object. The feeling of warmth is not similar to temperature. The senses are like physical instruments. So I have a thermometer here. The height of mercury there, which is shown as 60, is the form of registering temperature. Height is not similar to temperature. Temperature is average kinetic energy of the molecule's motion. You can't say, well, does that look like height? No, it's different. You cannot compare form and object. The form is the form of grasping the object. The object has an attribute. Your senses are or are not able to pick up and register that attribute. And when they do it in some form. If you experienced the heat, the temperature, as a vibration of molecules, that would be a completely valid form of responding to the same fact. If somehow you could see the temperature, when things get hot enough, you do see the light emitted. You're not really seeing the temperature, but you see the red hot thing glow red hot. In a way, you're perceiving the heat. That's not quite the same thing. But if you could just look at an object and tell how warm it was, that would be a valid form of perceiving. Take a radical case. Suppose that we rewired your brain so that everything was switched in color. What was yellow to you before now looks blue. The sky looks yellow. Bananas look blue. Red and green is switched. So everything is changed to its opposite. If this had come at a time of life when you were used to the old system, it would be quite amazing. But you would get the same information content that you got before. You'd be perceiving the same reality. And if you had had this wiring from birth, you wouldn't even know that you had anything different from anybody else. Why? Because you would learn the word yellow when your mother points to things like the banana. Internally, you have this form, because your brain's wired differently in our example, you have the same form of response that your mother has when she looks at the blue sky. But you learn to apply the word yellow to that kind of look. And when you look at the sky, your mother says blue. To you, it looks like the banana looks to her. It doesn't matter. You call that blue. So that's blue. And it doesn't matter what the form of experiencing that color is for you internally. You have the same conceptual names and categories and classifications as anybody else. Nor can you say that, well, maybe the senses are defective and give you a wrong reading. Take the thermometer. You know, sometimes an air gap appears in the mercury. You've seen that, right? So particularly with the kind you put in your mouth. Sometimes the mercury separates and you get a problem. So surely in the second case of the broken thermometer, it's giving you the wrong reading. So it's like a sense that's erred. No, it does not give you the wrong reading. It gives you a reading that you would perhaps misidentify if you didn't understand what's going on. The problem is not in the reading. The problem is not in the height of the mercury. The height of the mercury is a physical fact determined by reality. The problem is in the calibration of the scale. Once that air bubble appears in the mercury, you have to recalibrate the scale. That's the equivalent in this analogy to your conceptual identification of the object. So you'd have to recalibrate your scale if something went wrong. But as long as one temperature produces one unique height of the mercury at the top, you've got a fully functional thermometer and there's no error. Here's the killer example of the difference between form and object. I hope you can hear this, because that's part of it. I'm now shuffling this deck of cards. Could you hear that at all? Okay. I shuffled the cards. You heard it and you saw it. You saw and heard the same action. I felt it. So I saw, heard, and felt the same fact of reality. 3 forms of perceiving the same fact. Simpler example, make a fist. Take your other hand and do this. Feel the shape of your fist. Gee, you see the shape of your fist and you feel the shape of your fist. It's a very different experience to feel the shape and to see the shape. But the object in reality is the same. So these are different sensory modalities giving you the same object in different forms. Okay? The perceptual form in which you experience some fact is metaphysically given. You don't choose it. If you're colorblind, you didn't choose to be colorblind. If you're a bat and perceived by sonar, you didn't choose to do that. The form of perception is set by your physiology. It's metaphysically given. It's not judgeable. It's not a virtuous form of perception or a naughty form of perception. It just is the equipment you have. It's part of the identity of the faculty of consciousness for you. The form of perception, the physiology, and the form that results is part of the identity of consciousness. That's why the form-object distinction is of fundamental importance to objectivism, because the whole objectivist epistemology is about integrating the identity of consciousness into epistemology. Aristotle grasped that A is A, that reality contains no contradictions, that we have to obey the identity of things in the external world. Ayn Rand's essential contribution to epistemology is, and we have to obey the identity of our cognitive equipment. The form of perceiving is one aspect of a very broad topic, the identity of man's consciousness. And in the case of perception, obeying the identity of consciousness means simply not confusing what's metaphysically given, which is the form, and the object, which is out there in reality. So your form is valid, the object exists, you are aware of it. Just an advanced preview, when we get to the conceptual level, that is subject to your free will, and you choose the form. It's not determined by your physiology, whether you speak French or English. It's not determined by your physiology, whether you give a proper or improper definition to freedom. It's not determined by your physiology, whether you form more abstract concepts or just coast along on the ones close to the perceptual level. So the identity of your conceptual knowledge in terms of its form is largely controlled by you, and that's why we need epistemology to tell us the right way. But on the perceptual level, it's all deterministic, it's all set by physiological facts. And the philosophically hard thing to do is to separate form and object in each case, to separate the epistemological from the metaphysical. The epistemological is on the side of form, the metaphysical is what's out there in reality. And everybody loves Ayn Rand's definition, a theory of definitions where she says essences are epistemological, not metaphysical. If you've read that far ahead. Objectivists seem to think that's the greatest thing since sliced bread. And it is great, but that's not the greatest thing that she did. But it's one great thing. That is assigning to form essence. Essence is a form of holding information. And saying it's not a fact of reality that something's essential. It's based on a fact of reality. But to call something essential is a contextual judgment, creating a form of holding concretes. It's not those concretes, it's not in the concretes. We'll see that more in the next lecture. Actually, we won't. It's not in this whole series of lectures, but we'll be laying the groundwork for it in the next lecture. So confusing form and object in regard to perception generates two persistent errors. One is assigning to the external object what is actually our form of perceiving it. That's what's known as naive realism. And that's just a primitive error. For example, you think that your hand is registering the temperature as it is in itself. This is the I call them as they are view. You don't realize that your hand has sensory receptors that could be themselves cooled down or warmed up, and your form of responding would change. The other error is making our form of perceiving into an object interposed between the mind and the external world. Unlike naive realism, which is an innocuous error, not of great import, this is the whole enemy in epistemology. Representationalism. It operates on both the conceptual and the perceptual level. We're concerned with the perceptual level. Here's the diagram of representationalism. When you look at a tree, you don't see the tree, you see a representation of the tree, which is like on an inner screen, which means there's a little man in your head, the homunculus, to look at the inner screen. Now, ironically, it's the same error here as naive realism. The little man in the head looking at the little tree on the screen sees it no-how. He sees it without means. He just apprehends it. He just knows that there's an image of a tree there. So it's like naive realism moved back inside consciousness. The problem is that this is false. There is no image when you perceive. There's no image. You do not perceive an image. If you close your eyes, you can form an image, but when you look out in reality, you're not looking at images, you're looking at objects. And the other problem is, if once you say this, you have no way of knowing what the tree is in reality. All you know is what you see on your inner screen. You say, well, it's caused by the tree in reality. Really? How do you know that? Well, it doesn't matter what you say. It's based upon perception. But here, perception is internal. It's subjective. So you can't ever get out. Kant took it to its logical conclusion. We don't know what's out beyond what we perceive. We only know what's on the inner screen. And he called what's out there the noumenal world, things as they are in themselves. What we know is the phenomenal world, things as they appear to us. Radical separation. We're locked inside our minds. We cannot perceive the world. Why? Because we have a form of perceiving it. We cannot perceive the world because we have a form of perceiving it. Or as Ayn Rand said, we're blind because we have eyes. We're deaf because we have ears. The proper understanding of appearance and reality, which Kant is making reality unknowable, and what we see is the appearance. You see, is that the appearance is the form in which we perceive reality. So we don't perceive appearances. We don't see the looks of things. Things look to us a certain way because of our physiology. We don't look at the looks. We don't hear our perception of hearing. We don't smell the smelling. We smell reality. Often it doesn't smell that good. We see reality. We hear actions, events in reality. Now, where does it come up, even the distinction between appearing and reality? Well, there are some appearances that are misleading, like the bent stick, or a much simpler case. Just last night, I saw a woman and went up to her and greeted her warmly and gave her a big hug because I mistook her for someone else. This actually happened last night. It was great because that's one of my prepared examples. Someone looks like someone else. It appeared to be Donna, but it was, I think it was Vicky was her name. So there's no philosophical problem that Vicky looks like Donna. But that could, give rise to, it seemed to be Donna, but it wasn't. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with saying that. The invalid use is when you say, I saw a seeming Donna. No, I didn't see I saw Vicky who looks like Donna. The appearance is not an object, it's a form of perceiving an object. So you can compare a sensory form to a sensory form. Vicky's looks are like Donna's looks. Vicky's appearance is like Donna's appearance. You can't compare form to object. Well, what is Donna? I know what Donna looks like. I know what Vicky looks like. But what is she really? What does she really look like? You can't say that. You can't compare the height of the mercury to temperature. You can't compare the looks of things to how they really are. It's those two are not in the same category. They can't be compared. It's like, is peanut butter really like Saturday, or is it different from Saturday? It's not one or the other. So to summarize, perceptual awareness is awareness of some object in some form by some means. It always is. There's no such thing as I call them as they are. It's always I see them in some form determined by the nature of my senses, and I use that to identify reality. Perceptual awareness is not image viewing. It's not predicting the stick will look this way when I take it out of water. It's not making conceptual judgment. I see that is a bent stick. It's just seeing the stick submerged in water. And to go back to their argument from delusion, perceptual awareness is not dreaming or hallucinating. Perceptual awareness is awareness. To perceive is to perceive. So the full statement from Galt is much more involved and covers much more bases than the scaled down ... version that I gave you last time. And I want to close by reading the full statement, which I think we're now prepared to appreciate. The day when he grasps that his senses cannot deceive him, that physical objects cannot act without causes, that his organs of perception are physical and have no volition, no power to invent or to distort, which depends on volition. Distortion and invention are departure from the way things are, which can only be done by a free will interposed step between the cause and the effect. No power to invent or distort, that the evidence they give him is an absolute. But his mind must learn to understand it. The bent stick, that is the straight stick, half submerged in water, is correctly perceived. There's no such thing as not being correctly perceived. But what it means about what will happen when you take it out of water is something you have to learn by your intellect. His mind must discover the nature, the causes, the full context of his sensory material, such as if it's in water, half in water, that may affect the form of perceiving it, as opposed to perceiving it solely through air. His mind must identify the things that he perceives, such as, this is a straight stick. That is the day of his birth as a thinker and a scientist. It's a long trip from the day when. That is the day of his birth as a thinker and scientist. Now, that is the correct understanding of perception, and I will end with that fantastic paragraph from Galt's speech to a dying world in the hope that we can stop the death of our current world. Thank you. We'll take questions next. Let me just add in something that I didn't have time for, but is worth noting. The very idea that the senses made a mistake is a stolen concept. To say the senses made a mistake, is fully equivalent to saying the United States Constitution is illegal. The Constitution is illegal. So it could be contradictory, it could be mistaken, it could be a lot of things, but it can't be illegal because the Constitution is the foundation of all the law. It's the highest law of the land. So the highest law of the land can't be illegal because there's no higher standard to judge it by, right? In the same way, the senses make a mistake compared to what? I once gave an exam at the first teaching I did in 1966. I taught this material, and I gave an exam, and one of the questions was, how can we know before even hearing it that any attack on the validity of the senses is mistaken? And one student said, well, if we hear it, our senses have to be valid to hear it. He answered that, and he said, how can we know even before hearing it? I hadn't even thought of that. Even to grasp the attack on the senses, you have to use your senses. The only standard we have of, oh, that was a mistake, is what we see, what we touch, our contact with reality. There's this wonderful line in Galt's speech, things as they are things as perceived by your mind. So contrast things as they are in themselves, things as they seem to us. And she is using that to say there's no dichotomy. You perceive things as they are in a form. Things as they are things as perceived by your mind. Okay, first question.
Skeptics will argue that different perceptions refute objectivity.
Did they refute it objectively, or did they just make you feel like they were refuting?
Well, I mean, they think that it refutes objectivity.
Do they really think that in reality, or is that just how we perceive what they think?
Well, my question is,
okay.
What about when one person perceives something and the other does not? Without appealing to society for a second opinion, how can two people where one heard a noise and the other didn't resolve their disagreement? How do we know if one person is hallucinating or another person has bad hearing?
Skeptics are hallucinating. That's a revealed truth. The question is, how do we know when one person perceives something and another person doesn't, which one is correct? Well, obviously, the person who perceives it has more information than the person who doesn't perceive it. There's no perception of non-existence. So if somebody says, did you hear that? And I say, no. It's not that I heard the absence of that. I simply didn't hear that. So there's no contradiction. One person has information that the other one doesn't. Now, it's true that there are cases of very subliminal, marginal perception where you're not even sure you heard something. That's not really up to the level of perception. Ayn Rand once said, perception is not the perception of the split second. And I stress that in my definition of perception is an ongoing discrimination of an entity. So perception isn't what, did I see something there? That's not perception. Perception is that's perception. It's when you ongoingly moving around, exploring, achieve an awareness. Doesn't have to be through multiple senses, but ideally it is. of an object in reality. That's perception. So if one person says, you see this microphone here? You hear it? Feel it? Put your hand on it here. And the others, no, I don't know what you're talking about. He's either lying or needs medical attention.
Okay.
There's just no place for the skeptic to get his leverage into this thing. There's just no such thing as misperceiving. Non-perceiving, sure, that happens. Blind people exist. Dead people kind of exist. And they don't perceive at all. But you can't make any hay out of that. Yes, there's a distinction between getting more information and getting less, but whatever you get, and it's an absolute. And to even start to question it removes the possibility of forming a question. All questions are based upon knowledge. All knowledge is based upon perception, because perception is our primary contact with the world.
But how does the person with bad hearing avoid this conclusion that, oh, he's just hearing things, he's hallucinating, there's no real voice
The person
there?
with bad hearing simply doesn't hear as much. Like, I have trouble hearing you because I'm older, and I can't make out as many auditory distinctions as a young person can. And I go to the lab to have that decline in my hearing measured. It's perfectly objective. They know exactly which frequencies I'm deficient in. There's no skeptical implications whatsoever. There's no more than when you close your eyes, you don't see. There's no skeptical implication in getting less information. If you hear voices, like some of these psycho killers, then you need medical attention, and no epistemology will help you. That's a hallucination. None of us have that. So, okay, let me take the next question.
Thanks.
Thank you. So, I'm not attacking you for asking that. That's great to raise those objections that the skeptics do. Yeah.
So I'm trying to integrate what you're saying with the rest of my knowledge of the history of philosophy.
Good.
Would you say that Kant's sort of scam is to base perception, which is not infallible, unerring, base perception, which is unerring, on conception, which is erring? So he's making, if you're going to try to make a validation of the senses,
Yes.
it's going to end up being a circle.
Yes.
That's his whole shebang right there, right?
Yes, Kant says that sensations are the given, so he's a sensationalist, and we use the categories of the understanding, which are, or first the forms of intuition, which are conceptual content, to infer what entities must be, to apply to them constructs, in effect, of the mind to put in causality. We put in causality, we put in entities. That's not from reality, Kant says. That's just something the mind puts in, conceptual content added to. So we perceive it already interpreted by some hidden filters that operate to distort. I mean, he would say we can't call it distorting because that's what we've got to work with, but it amounts to that. So we get a censored reality, we get an interpreted reality with the conceptual categories and forms of intuition, adding stuff to it that's not in the actual experience. So it's like Descartes' evil demon is in each of us. Only Kant wants to say, let's not call him evil. But he's adding content to all of our perception. So yes, you're exactly right. It's getting the whole thing wrong. The right hierarchy is perception, concepts, sensations as high abstractions from perception. So brightness, for example, is a very advanced concept. Naming an aspect, an elementary aspect of sensation. This is a perception. This is not unusual. Take the concept atom. So you could be confused. You could say, well, atom is more basic than podium, more basic than person, because people are collections of atoms, and the podium is a collection of atoms. So atom comes first, table and podium and person comes later. No, that's confusing size with epistemological priority. The concept atom does not appear until a high degree of civilization, the flowering of ancient Greece, right? It's unknown before that, which covers 396,000 years. So just as atom, even though it's elementary in a certain sense, is an advanced concept that comes way after podium, so brightness is an advanced concept that comes way after podium. It's an abstraction from experience. Okay.
1 minute.
Yes.
Yes, I was just curious in comparing naive realism with representationalism, and is essentially naive realism confusing the object with form, and representationalism confusing the form with the object? I don't know if I said that right, but
I would put it this way. Naive realism doesn't realize the whole issue of form. It says, look, the apple is red. You see the apple, it's red. Well, what about a colorblind man who sees it as gray? I don't know. I thought the red is in the apple and we see it. The representationalist says, aha, so the red's not in the apple, the red's in us. And when we think we see a red apple, we're really seeing what's in us. When we think that there's a solid object out there, there's really only a solid object mentally. We experience this squeezing, we can't squeeze it, so we call that solid, but that's an experience in us. So out there are no solid objects. So the representationalist grasps that there's a form and puts it in us. But actually, the form is neither in us nor in the object. It's in the interaction of the form and the us and the object. Mm-hmm. So when an apple interacts with human senses, a certain perception appears. That is, it is perceived in, I shouldn't say appears, comes about. We perceive the apple in a certain form. The form of perceiving it is not in the apple, and it's not in us. It's in our interaction with the apple, just as clapping is not in this hand or in this hand, but is in the interaction. So the perception results from the interaction of the object with the sensory apparatus.